January 29th, 1976. Auckland, New Zealand. 13-year-old Tracey Ann Patient leaves her friend's house to walk home, but she never arrives. The following day, Tracey's body is discovered in some bushes, and she has been strangled to death with a pair of pantyhose, which were tightened around her neck with a stick. Nearly 2 years later, police receive an anonymous phone call from a man who claims that a ring Tracey had worn can be found in a rubbish bin, and he also provides a series of numbers which he says are connected to the case. Even though police do recover the ring from this location, they are unable to figure out the meaning of the caller's numbers, and Tracey's killer is never identified. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be traveling down under to New Zealand to cover an unsolved 46-year-old cold case, the 1976 murder of Tracey Ann Patient. That voice you just heard narrating our intro was Kimberly Wyse, the latest winner of our most recent Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, so thank you very much, Kimberly. This is a recurring monthly contest which we've been holding for nearly 5 years now, and if you'd like to enter and haven't already done so, I will be providing instructions near the end of this episode. So the Trail Went Cold has only ever covered one case from New Zealand, which was the 1975 disappearance of Mona Blades, and since that episode came out over 3.5 years ago, I thought we were long overdue to go back there and explore another mystery. The murder of 13-year-old Tracey Ann Patient is actually one of New Zealand's more prominent cold cases, as her family had emigrated there from the United Kingdom a few years earlier. While walking home from a friend's house one night, Tracey would be abducted and murdered by an unknown individual who proceeded to use a stick to tighten some pantyhose around her neck and strangle her to death. When Tracey's body was found, a signet ring she always wore on her finger was conspicuously missing, but nearly 2 years later, an anonymous caller phoned police and directed them to a location where they could find it. It seems very likely that the caller was Tracey's killer, and he also provided a series of 6 numbers which he said were related to the case. Well, even though the caller promised to make contact again, he never did, and while investigators were hoping that these numbers might help them crack the case, they've never been able to figure them out, and the murder remains unsolved. Anyway, after I finish discussing Tracey's case, I'm going to spend some time talking about another similar crime from New Zealand, and that's the 1970 murder of 18-year-old Olive Walker. Like Tracey, Olive was also abducted and killed while walking to a family member's residence, and this case is also still unsolved, so they both deserve coverage on this episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or a review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the murder of Tracey Ann Patient. Our story begins in Auckland, New Zealand in 1976. Our central figure is 13-year-old Tracey Ann Patient, who originally hails from the United Kingdom. 2 years earlier, Tracey's parents, John and June Patient, had decided to emigrate to New Zealand alongside Tracey's older sister Debbie, who was 15 by this point, and her younger sister Denise, who was 8. The Patient family now reside in Auckland's Henderson suburb at a house on Delwood Avenue. In contrast to North America, New Zealand's summer season lasts from December until February, so on January the 29th, Tracey and her sisters were on holidays from school. That evening, Debbie was granted permission by her mother to attend a Doobie Brothers concert at Weston Springs Stadium, so Tracey also asked if she could go out and visit her friend, Lynette Holland. When June said yes, Tracey and Debbie both left together and walked in the direction of Chilcot Road, where Lynette lived just under 2 kilometers away. The two sisters eventually went their separate ways, as Debbie headed to the concert while Tracey visited Lynette. After spending the evening at her friend's residence, Tracey phoned up her mother and promised that she would be home in time for her 9:30 p.m. curfew. Tracey and Lynette then left and walked together for a brief period until they reached the corner of Edmonton Road and Great North Road, the approximate halfway point to the Patient residence. The two friends then parted ways as Lynette went back home, while Tracey headed down Great North Road in the direction of her home, but even though the walk should have only taken about 10 minutes, Tracey never arrived. By 10 p.m., Tracey was still not home, so her family went outside to search the neighborhood for her. When they failed to find her, they became concerned enough to contact the Henderson police station in order to report Tracey missing. Well, the following morning, Tracey's body would be discovered in some bushes on a graveled lay-by located just off Scenic Drive next to the Waitakere Ranges. The location was about 16 kilometers from where Tracey was last seen, and she had been strangled to death with a pair of pantyhose, which had been tied to a stick before it was wrapped and twisted around her neck. In spite of this, Tracey's body was fully clothed, and she was not sexually assaulted. No fingerprints, footprints, or tire tracks could be found at the scene, so it was theorized that a motorist may have picked up Tracey somewhere on Great North Road. They then proceeded to kill her inside the vehicle before dumping her body on the lay-by. The only item of Tracey's which appeared to be missing was a signet ring, which had been given to her by her boyfriend but was no longer on her finger. It had the initials JP inscribed on it, so police would release a sketch of the ring to the public. After Tracey's murder started generating publicity, investigators were contacted by an elderly couple who recalled seeing her after she parted ways with Lynette. The couple had been walking their dog on Great North Road, and while passing the Henderson police station, they crossed paths with Tracey, who asked them the time. After they responded, they said that Tracey started running in the direction of her house, possibly because she was running late to make it home in time for her curfew. Tracey's family found it unlikely that she would have ever climbed into a vehicle with a stranger and wondered if she had hitched a ride with someone she knew. However, many of Tracey's friends and acquaintances, including her boyfriend, had been attending the same Doobie Brothers concert that her sister Debbie went to that night. In total, around 850 potential suspects were investigated, but none of them raised any red flags. But it turned out that on that very same night, a teenage jogger reported being stalked on Great North Road by an unidentified man who was driving what she described as a cream or white 1967 Ford Cortina. The jogger managed to get away from him by taking a shortcut through the yard of Henderson Primary School, but the incident is believed to have occurred around the approximate time period Tracey was seen by the elderly couple. Since Tracey would have passed by Henderson Primary School on her route home, could she have crossed paths with the man in the Cortina? Well, even though police announced that they were searching for a vehicle matching its description, they were unable to track it down. Nearly 2 months after Tracey's murder, a woman made an anonymous call to Youthline, a telephone counseling helpline for young people. She claimed that at around 9:30 p.m. on the evening of January the 29th, she had seen a blonde girl matching Tracey's description climbing into a brown car on Great North Road, which was being driven by a man in a brown suit. The woman hung up before she identified herself, and all attempts to track her down or compel her to come forward were unsuccessful. Sometime in 1977, a map with Tracey's name on it was found inside a Ford Thames van, which just happened to match the description of a van seen in the Henderson suburb on the night Tracey went missing. But it turned out that the owner of this van had not actually purchased it until after Tracey's murder took place, so he was not considered to be a suspect, and unfortunately, investigators had no luck figuring out the identity of the van's previous owner. Well, on November the 22nd of that year, a much more promising lead occurred when police received an anonymous call from a man who claimed to have information about Tracey's case. He said that Tracey's missing signet ring could be found wrapped in tissue inside a rubbish bin located outside the Avondale Urgent Dispensary on Great North Road. The caller also shared a series of numbers which he implied were connected to the case. 126040. The man promised to call back 8 days later before he hung up, and sure enough, his tip checked out, as police did find a signet ring in the aforementioned rubbish bin with the initials JP inscribed on it, and it was positively identified as having belonged to Tracey. However, the anonymous tipster never called back again like he promised, and investigators were unable to figure out the significance of the 6 numbers he provided. The Patient family found themselves unable to remain in New Zealand, so they moved back to their native England. They also brought Tracey's body with them, and she was buried at the Manor Park Cemetery and Crematorium in Greater London. The investigation remained at a standstill for decades, but Tracey's story would receive additional exposure when it was featured on an episode of the true crime show Sensing Murder in 2006. The premise of the show involved psychics traveling to locations where unsolved murders had taken place in hopes that they might receive new information to help rejuvenate the investigations. When psychic Deb Weber visited the spot where Tracey's body was found, she said that Tracey's spirit spoke to her and shared the name of her killer, a man who happened to live in the area in 1976. Well, Weber turned this information over to the police, and the man was interviewed at some point. Like many others, his alibi was that he was attending the Doobie Brothers concert at Weston Springs Stadiums that night. While investigators were unable to conclusively verify his alibi after so many years, it sounds like this lead never went anywhere. In March of 2010, Tracey's older sister Debbie agreed to be interviewed by the magazine, the Australian Women's Weekly New Zealand edition, marking the first time that anyone from the Patient family had spoken to the media in decades. Debbie said that she had recently been emailed by a woman known only as Rose, who claimed she knew the identity of Tracey's killer. Rose, who was 11 years old in 1976, believed that Tracey was murdered by the 21-year-old son of one of her neighbors. This man had been released from an Australian prison a short time before Tracey was killed, and afterward, Rose said that the neighbor's car was locked in the garage and cleaned and repainted before it was sold. Rose also claimed that she saw Tracey's signet ring inside the neighbor's house at one point and heard the perpetrator's mother confess to his involvement. Before she contacted Debbie, Rose had gone to the police with this information in 2006, but they did not believe she was a credible witness. While Debbie thought that Rose's claims needed to be investigated more thoroughly, it's been reported that police made inquiries with Australian prison and immigration authorities and learned that the alleged killer was out of the country when Tracey's death took place. This lead ultimately never went anywhere, but in January of 2016, to commemorate the 40th anniversary of Tracey's murder, the police announced that they had resumed a full-time investigation into her case. This involved launching a new tip line called Operation Tracey, where they received over 150 calls, though many of them were from people who provided their own theories about the series of numbers from the anonymous caller. In July of that year, a man named Gary Ross did an interview with the New Zealand news media website Stuff, in which he revealed that both he and a friend had seen Tracey in the presence of an unidentified man at around 9:30 p.m. on the night she went missing. Ross's friend was deceased by this point, but Ross said they were both chatting next to a parked car on Great North Road when they saw a middle-aged or elderly man wearing a hat walk by, who was leading a girl matching Tracey's description by the elbow. While Ross did not believe that the girl was struggling, he still felt that the man was leading her along aggressively. Ross said that when he learned about Tracey's murder in the news, he contacted the police to share what he had seen, but even though they took down Ross's details and promised to call him back, no one ever did. Over the years, Ross kept trying to contact the police multiple times, but claimed that they seemed to ignore him and had little interest in what he had to say. When asked about this, the police expressed their skepticism that Ross actually saw Tracey, as his sighting would have taken place at a spot which was 500 meters west of the corner of Great North Road and Edmonton Road, the opposite direction of where Tracey would have headed after she parted ways with Lynette Holland. By the end of 2016, police announced that they were winding down the investigation into Tracey's murder due to a lack of solid leads. For the first time since losing her sister, Debbie traveled back to New Zealand in order to visit the spot where Tracey's body was found and leave flowers there. Debbie stated that she had not forgiven the person who murdered Tracey and hoped they had a quote-unquote awful life, and were so tormented by what they did that they might give themselves up. But sadly, after 46 years, there are still no answers about who actually killed Tracey Ann Patient. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Hi there, I would just like to take a few moments to give a shout out to another podcast titled Wrongful Conviction. Hosted by celebrated criminal justice reform advocate and founding board member of the Innocence Project, Jason Flom, and by Pulitzer Prize-winning podcast host and producer Maggie Freeling, Wrongful Conviction features intimate conversations with men and women who have spent years in prison for crimes they did not commit. Each episode peels back the layers to tell the stories of those who have found themselves caught in a legal system gone wrong. Wrongful Conviction with Maggie Freeling airs each Monday, and Jason Flom's episodes air on Thursdays. Please search, find, and follow Wrongful Conviction wherever you listen to podcasts. So even though I didn't intentionally plan things out this way, while I was researching this case, I realized that Tracey's murder had a number of parallels to the story I featured on last week's episode, the murder of 14-year-old Dana Bradley, which took place in Newfoundland in 1981. In both cases, the victim was a teenage girl who left a friend's house to return home, but seemingly crossed paths with someone who lured them into a vehicle before killing them. And when the victim's body was found, they were fully clothed with no obvious signs of sexual assault, making one wonder what the motive for these crimes really was. We'll talk more about this lead later on, but another similarity between Tracey and Dana's cases is that they each involved a witness coming forward decades after the fact who were convinced they knew the identity of the killer. In both these situations, the witness was a child when the murders originally took place, but the police would ultimately find credibility issues with their stories and dismiss the people they were accusing as suspects. While Tracey Ann Patient's murder is considered to be one of the more prominent unsolved cold cases in the history of New Zealand, there is surprisingly not a great deal of information available about it online, and most of what you will find was published after the crime's 40th anniversary took place in 2016. Tracey's story did get some extra media attention when it was compared to one of New Zealand's more infamous crimes of recent memory, and that's the death of Grace Millane, who was murdered on her 22nd birthday in December of 2018. Like Tracey, Grace was a British citizen, and she just happened to be visiting Auckland on a backpacking trip when she was murdered by a sex offender named Jesse Shane Kempson. The biggest parallel between the two cases was that Grace's body was found in the Waitakere Ranges alongside Scenic Drive, not too far from the spot where Tracey's body had been dumped nearly 43 years earlier. I know there has been speculation that Tracey's disappearance might be connected to a pair of other cold cases involving young women, which took place in New Zealand during the 1970s, even though they both occurred hundreds of kilometers away from Auckland. One of them is the disappearance of 18-year-old Mona Blades, who vanished while attempting to hitchhike from Hamilton to Hastings on May 31st, 1975. The other one is the unsolved murder of 18-year-old Olive Walker, which took place in the town of Rotorua on May 15th, 1970. It's possible that all three of these victims were murdered after being offered a ride, though no evidence has been found to indicate that the cases are connected. Regardless, I will still be talking about Olive Walker's murder later on in this episode after I'm done discussing Tracey's case, and if you want to learn more about Mona Blades' disappearance, I covered it on episode 99 of the podcast. Now, I might sound like a broken record, but this is just one of many older cases I've covered involving the murder or disappearance of a young person, in which you could apply the cliched expression, it was just a much different time. Today, it might raise some eyebrows that a 13-year-old girl like Tracey was making a nearly 2-kilometer walk home at night while she was alone, but back in 1976, people just did not envision terrible events like this happening, and I don't get the impression that Henderson was a suburb which was rife with violent crime back then. What makes the crime all the more brazen is that Tracey was last seen walking past the Henderson police station, so she likely crossed paths with her killer a fairly short distance away from there. And to make things even more tragic, Tracey's family had moved to New Zealand from England 2 years earlier because her parents felt that their children would be living in a much safer environment and have a better life there. After the Patients moved back to England following Tracey's murder, they stopped talking to the media for decades, but in recent years, her older sister Debbie has pretty much become the family spokesperson and has done everything she can to be Tracey's advocate and spread awareness of her story. For years, Debbie dealt with serious guilt and depression over the loss of her sister, as she always regretted asking for permission to attend a Doobie Brothers concert that night. This is what prompted Tracey to ask if she could go out and spend the evening at her friend Lynette's house, so Debbie felt that if she hadn't gone to the concert, Tracey might never have been killed. When the two sisters walked together through the neighborhood that night and went their separate ways, Debbie always regretted not turning around to say goodbye to Tracey, as she did not anticipate this would be the last time she saw her alive. But of course, the only person to blame for Tracey's death is her killer, and the whole situation was definitely not Debbie's fault. But you can understand how the bereaved families of victims often find themselves second-guessing their decisions as part of their trauma. Tracey's murder also devastated her younger sister Denise, who was only 8 years old at the time, and during one interview, Debbie read this heartbreaking letter that Denise had written, quote, "The saddest thing for me is that I can't remember my sister. Whether that was due to my age when it happened, or my memory blocking out the part of New Zealand, I don't know, and to put that down on paper really hurts, because I feel so guilty I can't remember. I do have memories of the night that she went missing, and my dad coming in crying, telling us what happened. Since it happened, I've always been frightened of the dark. I vaguely remember going out with my family one time in the dark one night after it happened and shaking terribly. Over the years, I've had terrible nightmares of someone trying to get me and always waking up just as they catch me. Because of what's happened to our family and how it's affected me, I've tried not to be really overprotective of my children, and I'm still fighting a battle with myself when they go out, especially at nighttime. I hope, as we all do, that something comes of it." End quote. Well, the fact of the matter is that this appears to be one of those unfortunate cold cases where the perpetrator just seemed to get very lucky and managed to commit this crime without leaving much in the way of evidence behind. It's been established that Tracey left Lynette's house to head home that night, and the two friends walked together to the corner of Edmonton Road and Great North Road before they went their separate ways. And after this, we've had 3 reported sightings of Tracey. One of them was from the couple walking their dog on Great North Road, who said that Tracey passed by them and asked what time it was. There doesn't seem to be much dispute that this sighting is legitimate, but the other 2 sightings of Tracey are a bit more questionable. One of them was the anonymous woman who phoned Youthline 2 months later and reported having seen Tracey climb into a brown car with a man in a brown suit. And the other account was provided by Gary Ross, who reported having seen a middle-aged or elderly man leading Tracey down Great North Road by her elbow. But of course, what complicated these 2 sightings is that the anonymous woman never came forward, and Ross believed that the police either kept ignoring him or didn't take his claim seriously. While all 3 of these sightings I described have contradictions with each other. The elderly white couple claimed they saw Tracey at 295 Great North Road near the Henderson police station, while Ross's sighting occurred at 360 Great North Road, which is about 500 meters west. Tracey had been heading east towards her family's house, so unless she crossed paths with her killer, and this man forcibly dragged her hundreds of meters in the opposite direction, possibly towards a parked vehicle, why would Tracey be at the spot where Ross saw her? Even though the anonymous female caller reported seeing Tracey climbing into a car on Great North Road, I don't believe she specified an exact location on Great North Road, but the contradiction is that the woman said the man was wearing a brown suit, but Ross simply described him as wearing a hat, and I don't believe he ever mentioned a brown suit. What further complicates this situation are reports of an unidentified man driving a cream or white 1967 Ford Cortina who was seen stalking a teenage jogger on Great North Road around the same time period when Tracey was last seen. This incident took place near Henderson Primary School, located east of the Henderson police station, so it would have been on Tracey's route. Tracey would also apparently sometimes take a shortcut through the schoolyard whenever she walked home, so if the man driving the Cortina was the person who abducted and murdered Tracey, the timeline does work out. And if this is what happened, then I think you can discount the sightings from Ross and the anonymous caller. And here's another odd wrinkle in this whole situation. The discovery of the road map with Tracey's name on it inside a Ford Thames van over 1 year later. While all the scenarios I just outlined involve Tracey being abducted in a car, a van matching that description was apparently seen in the Henderson area on the night she was killed. This is definitely the most frustrating aspect of the investigation, as I have a ton of unanswered questions. When the map was found, the current owner of the van was not considered to be a suspect, since he did not actually purchase the van until after Tracey's death. So it's possible that Tracey's killer may have unknowingly left the map inside the van when he got rid of it, but I find it surprising that investigators were unable to figure out the identity of the previous owner. Yes, we are talking about the 1970s, when vehicle records were not electronic and would have been harder to track down, but how exactly did the new owner purchase this van to begin with? Did they purchase it secondhand at a dealership somewhere, or did they get it directly from the previous owner? If it's the second scenario, you think that at the very least, the new owner would have been able to provide a description of the person they bought the van from, but unfortunately, details about this lead are very scarce. But then again, a map with Tracey's name on it is not evidence that the previous owner of the van was responsible for killing her. For all we know, it may have just belonged to an outside party who had interest in the case and wrote down her name, and this whole angle is nothing more than a red herring. Tracey's family and friends have always found it unlikely that she ever would have climbed into a vehicle with a stranger, which is why there was speculation that she was harmed by someone she knew. But of course, it does not appear that the investigation into Tracey's personal life uncovered any promising suspects who raised red flags. However, the walk to Tracey's home from the intersection where she was last seen should have only taken around 10 minutes, so why would she even need to accept a ride in the first place? Well, when Tracey encountered the elderly couple and asked them the time, they said that she started running in the direction of her house, so perhaps she was worried she wouldn't arrive home in time for her 9:30 p.m. curfew. Her father was known for being quite strict about enforcing curfew, so this might be the one reason Tracey would have been inclined to hitch a ride from someone, even if she only had to travel a short distance. Now, if you research this case, some of the sources you'll find report that the pantyhose found wrapped around Tracey's neck belonged to her, but this information is not accurate, as she was wearing jeans that night. This seems to indicate that the killer already had the pantyhose in their possession when they encountered Tracey, and they may have also been carrying the stick, which was used to tighten the stocking around Tracey's neck. Since Tracey was not sexually assaulted, that does not appear to be the motive for the crime, so it's possible that the killer was prowling around that night searching for a random victim they were hoping to strangle to death. It's possible that Tracey did not climb into the perpetrator's vehicle, as they may have snuck up on her from behind and wrapped the pantyhose around her neck before forcibly dragging her inside. One of the biggest obstacles to solving the case is that the police had almost no physical evidence to work with, and they wouldn't have been thinking about DNA profiling back in 1976. But of course, now that 4 decades have passed and forensics have become so much more advanced, I have to wonder if traces of the perpetrator's DNA can be found on the pantyhose. However, investigators have never publicly addressed this, or confirmed or denied if any DNA evidence exists. So now let's start talking about some of the leads in this case. Many years ago, Tracey's story was featured on an episode of the TV series Sensing Murder, in which her spirit supposedly communicated with a psychic and shared the name of her killer. This person's name was bleeped out in the episode, but police did interview and investigate him. Details are vague, but while it doesn't sound like any evidence was found to implicate this man, I don't get the impression he has been completely ruled out either. Now, it's worth noting that Tracey's family declined to participate in the Sensing Murder episode, and I have no idea how much stock they put into its findings. I'm sure you've heard enough episodes of this podcast to know all my issues with psychics, and Sensing Murder has faced its fair share of criticism because none of the so-called leads produced by psychics on the show have ever led to one of the featured cases being resolved. As an example, many years ago, an American version of the Sensing Murder TV show was produced, and it featured an episode about the Orange Sock murders, where a pair of women named Bobby Overholzer and Annette Schnee were murdered by the same perpetrator at different times on the same night, while hitchhiking in Breckenridge, Colorado in January of 1982. Well, you've heard me talk about that case many times on this podcast, and the featured psychics on the Sensing Murder episode presented a convoluted scenario which involved 2 men being responsible for the murders, and their names were even shared with law enforcement. But surprise, surprise, it turned out they were completely off the mark, as a man named Alan Lee Phillips was finally arrested last year, and it looks like he committed the murders completely alone. In fact, Phillips never even popped up on the radar as a suspect until he was linked to the crime through genetic genealogy and DNA testing. Without knowing any details about the man who was named and the sensing murder episode about Tracey's case, I really can't comment too much about the validity of this lead, but I remain skeptical. Another major lead in this case was provided by a woman known only as Rose, who was certain that Tracey's killer was the 21-year-old son of one of her neighbors, and that his entire family conspired to cover up the crime. This is very reminiscent of a situation I chronicled last week in my episode about the murder of Dana Bradley, as it featured a man who went under the pseudonym Robert and told police he had repressed memories of witnessing Dana's murder as a child, claiming that a former neighbor and family friend was responsible. However, in both these cases, the police performed an investigation into the witnesses' claims and ultimately concluded they were without merit. I mean, I don't know any details about Rose or these neighbors of hers, but if police were able to establish that the man she was accusing of murder was out of the country on the night Tracey was killed, then there's really not much else you can say. It sounds like Rose tried to account for this by pointing a finger at the suspect's father instead, as this might account for some of the memories she had, such as seeing Tracey's missing signet ring inside this man's house. But I get the impression that police don't feel that anyone from this particular family was involved in the crime, so I'm hoping they did their due diligence before they dismissed Rose's story. Overall, this entirely might be nothing more than yet another dead end. However, now that we're on the subject of Tracey's signet ring, we should now discuss that development, as this is the most heavily discussed aspect of this case. Since the anonymous caller was able to direct police to the signet ring, this means he was most likely Tracey's killer, though there are a few alternate scenarios. It could have been someone who found the ring somewhere, or even came across Tracey's body and stole it from her finger before she was found. Or perhaps it was someone who was acquainted with the killer and preferred to remain anonymous, but decided to lead police to the ring and provide a series of numbers as a clue to the killer's identity. But the most logical explanation is that the caller was the perpetrator, and he did this because he wanted to taunt the authorities and was clamoring for attention. You could easily assume that he took Tracey's ring as a memento of his crime, but for as much flack as I gave the aforementioned sensing murder episode, one of the psychics did share a fairly intriguing alternate theory. If Tracey was being held captive in the perpetrator's vehicle, she may have decided to take off her ring and leave it behind as a clue in case she was murdered. For all we know, the ring could have been lying on the vehicle's floor for a long period of time before the killer even found it, which is why he did not contact the police until November of 1997, nearly 2 years after the crime took place. So the most hotly debated question is whether or not there is any significance to the numbers the caller provided, 126040. Well, for decades, everyone associated with this case have tried to crack what may very well be some sort of code, but they haven't had any success, and if you search online discussions, you will find no shortage of theories. For example, it seemed to fit the format of a New Zealand military service number 12/6040, but this possibility was apparently already explored, and it turned out the serviceman who had this number was killed in action during World War II. Another theory is that this could have been a prison number, and perhaps it had been assigned to the young man that Rose had accused of Tracey's murder, as he was released from prison shortly before the crime took place. There's also been speculation that it might well be a number for a combination lock, or that if you convert the numbers into letters, it will spell out some sort of clue, but one of the simpler explanations is that if you add up 1 plus 2 plus 6 plus 0 plus 4 plus 0, it equals 13, which was Tracey's age when she was killed. Since the caller told police he would phone them back, an alternate theory is that this was meant to be a secret signal for communications between them, as sharing those numbers during his calls would prove he was the same person. However, if you're an Occam's razor type of person, the most logical explanation is that these numbers don't mean anything at all, and the caller just decided to share them in order to toy with investigators and hope that they would waste time and resources trying to figure the whole thing out. For all we know, these numbers might make perfect sense to the killer in his own mind, but no one has been able to crack them. But given how little evidence there is to work with in this case, I can understand the need to keep focusing on these numbers in hopes they might provide the key to the mystery. So could the killer still be alive today? Well, if Gary Ross's sighting is accurate, and he actually saw Tracey being abducted by a middle-aged or elderly man, the odds of him still being alive 46 years later are not great. In fact, there's a chance that the perpetrator died a short time after he led police to the signet ring, which is why he never tried to contact them again. Well, as the past 4 years have demonstrated, investigative genetic genealogy has made it possible to solve cold cases by linking DNA evidence to suspects who are already deceased, positively identifying them as the perpetrator. It's possible that such a thing could happen here, but it's unclear to me if there is any DNA evidence available on items such as the pantyhose. Regardless, the good news is that Tracey's case has not been forgotten and has continued to remain in the spotlight after all these years, so there's always a chance that the right person might come forward with the necessary information, which leads to a resolution. So now I'm going to take a few moments to discuss another New Zealand case I previously mentioned, and that's the unsolved murder of Olive Walker, a young Maori woman who hailed from a family of 11 children. In 1970, Olive was 18 years old and living with her parents in the town of Rotorua, and on the evening of May the 15th, she was planning to visit her older sister Mary in order to babysit her kids. At 6:45 p.m., Olive left her home on Leslie Street in order to make a lengthy walk to Mary's residence on Malfroy Road. The last time Olive was confirmed to be alive was when some of her schoolmates saw her passing by the Odeon Theatre on Pakaki Street at 7:50, but she never arrived at her sister's place, and there would be reports of screams being heard on Malfroy Road that night. At around 11:30 p.m., a group of teenagers pulled into a highway rest area nearly 5 kilometers south of Rotorua and discovered Olive's partially clothed body on a lay-by. She had been bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument, and the damage was so severe that her skull was smashed into 7 pieces. Olive had also been sexually assaulted, and her approximate time of death was believed to have been sometime between 9:15 and 10:55 p.m. Olive was described as a shy girl who was a rather slow learner, and she did not have many friends or spend much time socializing. In fact, Olive's father would not allow her to have a boyfriend, as he felt that someone could easily take advantage of his daughter's gentle nature, and her family did not believe that Olive would have accepted a ride from someone she didn't know. Even though police investigated over 300 potential suspects and searched over 1,800 vehicles, they did not uncover anything to help them figure out the identity of Olive's killer. The most promising lead was a set of footprints at the scene, which seemed to match a particular brand of work boots which were often issued to forestry and sawmill workers. The Waipa sawmill, which had around 200 employees at that time, just happened to be located right behind the rest area, and the wounds on Olive's head suggested that the murder weapon might have been a picaroon, a metal-topped tool designed to handle logs. Well, much like Tracey Ann Patient's case, Olive's murder became the subject of an episode of Sensing Murder in 2006. Once again, it featured psychic Deb Weber supposedly receiving a communication from Olive's spirit and having a vision of a man whom she believed was the killer. Weber said that the man had a tattoo on his neck in the shape of a star, and the police decided to create an identikit sketch of him based on her description. When the sketch was released publicly, investigators received a number of tips pointing them towards a sex offender who bore a resemblance to the suspect and was currently serving time in prison. This man had a history of sex crimes dating all the way back to the early 1970s, and while police could not find any evidence linking him to Olive's murder, it does not sound like he has been ruled out either. It's been reported that he has since been released from prison and is living in the Rotorua area, but what I'm curious about is whether or not there are any plans to perform DNA testing. Traces of the killer's semen were found on Olive's underwear, and while DNA profiling was obviously not an option back in 1970, I would like to know if there is any evidence still available today, and if it can be compared with the DNA of the sex offender. Sadly, since there is so little information available about this case, I can't form too much of an opinion about what happened here, but I do think the theory about the killer being a sawmill worker is fairly plausible. Since the Waipa sawmill was in such close proximity to the rest area, that might explain why the killer chose this location to dump Olive's body. Unless I hear evidence suggesting otherwise, I am inclined to think that the murders of Tracey Ann Patient and Olive Walker are not connected, because even though there are a number of similarities between the two crimes, they took place 250 kilometers apart. But since Olive's murder is still unsolved, I felt it was worth mentioning on this episode in order to keep her memory alive. So if you happen to have any information about the murders of Tracey Ann Patient or Olive Walker, please contact the appropriate authorities. Anyway, another special thanks to listener Kimberly Wyse for narrating the opening of this week's episode. If you've already entered our listener voiceover contest before, you are automatically eligible for our next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you would like to enter and haven't already done so, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see featured on this podcast. Once again, send me an email under the subject line Trail Went Cold Contest to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. This past month, I released a bonus episode about an infamous case from Unsolved Mysteries, the disappearance of Anne Sigmund, who became a wanted fugitive for the murder of her estranged husband, Charlie Sigmund, and she has not been seen in 35 years. In addition, I've dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, cover yet another case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1987 murder of Dawn Smith. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Wigwolf, MT, Willio F, Kyle P, Hope G, Laura P, and Kathy. Thank you all so much for your support. Also, I wanted to mention that this coming Saturday, July the 23rd at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to be holding another Unsolved Mysteries live watch marathon, in which I'll be screening classic segments from Unsolved Mysteries, and you can watch them and chat with myself and your fellow listeners. I will be including the link to our screening room for this event in the show notes, and you can also find it pinned to the top of our social media pages. Once again, our Unsolved Mysteries live watch marathon takes place this coming Saturday, July the 23rd at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and we hope to see you there. In addition, The Trail Went Cold is going to be appearing at the True Crime Podcast Festival, which is taking place at the Weston Park Central Hotel in Dallas, Texas, from August the 27th until the 28th. Myself and many other prominent true crime podcasters will be in attendance, and there will be a bunch of panel sessions, discussions, and live episodes. So in order to purchase tickets, please visit the website truecrimepodcastfestival.com. That's truecrimepodcastfestival.com. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, which has a couple of interesting threads about the Tracey Ann Patient case, which explore a bunch of different theories surrounding the series of numbers. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourselves a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.